and welcome to the first episode of the third season of the Weekly Defence Podcast, the show about defence procurement and military technology. I am your host, Richard Thomas, and to kickstart a brand new year in this first podcast, we'll talk with the Director of Analysis at Shephard Defence Insight to get an idea as to what to expect from defence programmes across the three domains in 2021. And our land reporter grabs a chat with a senior advisor at the Centre for Strategic and International Studies to discuss recently released updates on one of the US Land Force's pillar programmes, the OMFV. But first, let's take a look at some of the news from this week. And we start in Australia, which has become the seventh country to declare initial operational capability for the Lockheed Martin F-35A multi-role fighter aircraft. Australia currently has a fleet of 33 F-35As out of 72 ordered, and RAAF crews have completed almost 9,000 flight hours on the aircraft to date. The F-35A fleet is expected to reach full operational capability for the RAAF in 2023. An 18-aircraft option on the contract is also expected to be exercised, according to Shephard Defence Insight. A second Israeli-made Iron Dome battery has been delivered to the US Army to protect troops against rockets, mortars, and other ballistic and aerial threats. This followed the arrival in September 2020 of the first Iron Dome system, which is still being implemented in the United States. Iron Dome forms part of the multi-layered Israeli missile defense system, which also includes David's Sling, Arrow 2 and Arrow 3. On the 15th of December 2020, the Israel Missile Defense Organization and the US Missile Defense Agency completed a series of intercept tests involving all of these systems. In Spain, Escribano Mechanical and Engineering is developing autonomous swarming UAVs for the country's MOD as part of the Rapaz program to evaluate unmanned technologies. In the Long-Range Intelligent Security System, UAV swarms could be launched from the future VCR 8x8 Dragon armoured vehicle, and these swarms would operate at 5 to 10 kilometres range for ISTAR and loitering munitions missions. And in naval news, having managed to negotiate 2020's twin challenges of the COVID-19 pandemic and the ongoing integrated review relatively unscathed, the UK Royal Navy has emerged into the new year with a bang with the announcement that the Queen Elizabeth Carrier Strike Group has reached initial operating capability. A statement released by the MOD on the 4th of January said that IOC had been reached on schedule following an earlier success during exercise Joint Warrior in Q3 2020, and as such was available for deployment at 5 days' notice. However, doubts remain around key elements of the Carrier Strike Group, and in particular the Crow's Nest AEW system, which itself will not be at IOC level by the time of the Carrier Strike Group's departure in May this year. And these were some of the stories. Let's now bring into the show the rest of the news team to catch up on what's been happening in defence during the festive season, as well as this first week back at work. Welcome to news editor Ben Vogel, land reporter Flava Camargos Pereira, and air editor Tim Martin. Hello, everyone.
Happy New Year.
Hello.
Hi, Rich. Happy New Year.
Happy New Year to all. Ben, let's start with a story from one of your contributors, your vast network of contributors, about a Russian air missile defense system. And I think it's developments on the S-500 Prometheus BMD capability, which has been in development for quite some time. So what more do we need to know?
That's right, yes. A story from Eugene Gurdon in St. Petersburg. And he reports that 2021 will be an important year for Prometheus, as its development is expected to be completed, paving the way for serial production by 2025.
So the S-500 sounds like it's a continuation from, obviously, the S-300 and the S-400. Talk to me about the space defense aspect, because I read through the copy, very interesting piece. Now, Russian news outlets have suggested that this S-500 could be on par in some respects with the US THAAD system. How viable do you think that might be?
Well, that remains to be seen, but certainly there is a anti-satellite or attacking space targets aspect to the S-500, and there is actually a broad set of potential targets, not just space targets, but also different types of missile flying at different altitudes, different kind of aerial targets. There's even supposedly a capability to destroy stealth aircraft such as the F-35, hypersonic missiles as well, which are known to be in development by potential Russian adversaries. So there is a broad range of capabilities for this particular weapon system, but it does require different kinds of missiles in order to attack those targets.
Exactly. You just mentioned different missile systems. So obviously you're going to look in the future to use a different missile than the S-400 at the moment.
It could use the same 40N6 warhead as the S-400. However, The S500 Prometheus has been known to be tested with a different kind of warhead that can travel a much longer distance. Also for the anti-satellite function or space target function, things travelling in low orbit, it might require something like the 77N6 heavyweight missile that Eugene reported on in his story. Overall, Richard, the S-500 is envisaged by the Russians as another tool in their kind of layered air and missile defence system. You mentioned the S-300 and the S-400. They'll remain in place and continue to play an important role, but the S-500 will be a kind of an augmentation to that kind of network.
Interesting. I mean, you wonder what role it's supposed to play, if not that very high-end ballistic missile defence and space effector. How might this system be integrated into existing Russian air defence network, or do we need to call it an air and space defence network at this point?
Probably air and space defence, if indeed the S-500 is deployed for that purpose of attacking low Earth orbit targets. Yes, the thinking in Russia, according to Eugene, is that the S-500 would function alongside the other systems that I mentioned, as well as the lower altitude target systems like the Pantsir and the Buk M3. And it would support those kind of systems, possibly in a network under automated control rather than function as a standalone system.
Thanks very much, Ben. Moving on to the land now, and Flavia, some news from the US Army's OMFV program. Now, I mentioned at the top of the show we'll be discussing the US Army's OMFV program in depth with CSIS a little later on, but I really want to bring in Flavia now to lay down some of the initial groundwork for context and consideration. So, Flavia, that's all yours.
Yeah, actually, the U.S. Army is progressing with this program, and in December last year, the service released the final request for proposal for the concept design phase. The aim of this stage is to produce 5 competing designs that could replace the Bradley. This is the most recent attempt of the service to retire this vehicle. That's a 30-plus years old platform. But according to the U.S. Army, this RFP describes the transformational vision for the OMFV. This service pointed out that this process intends to incentivize the industry, incentivize the innovation, maximize the competition, and produce a transformational platform.
Gordon, what are the main differences between the July 2020 draft RFP and the one released in December?
The July 2020 draft RFP was part of the first phase of this procurement process. This phase was the market research and requirement development. It was the phase that the Army invited the industry to present their point of view, to present their opinion. And actually, the Army made significant changes to the RFP since then. This service has reoriented the program based on the industry feedback, and some of the changes include the reduction in scope and deliverables in order to match the maturity of requirements in this phase of the program. This current RFP, the one released in December, is part of the concept design effort. This is the second phase of the OMFV procurement. This stage includes modeling, simulation, and analysis efforts, and the purpose is providing information for requirements refinement and conduct initial design activities. The aim actually is awarding up to 5 contracts during this year, 2021, under a full and open competition.
Well, I mean, you've outlined an awful lot of phases there. I was trying to follow. What's the near term? What's the next phase likely to be?
This next phase is the third one, and it is the detailed design, and it aims to choose up to 3 contracts. The purpose is to conduct development activities in this next phase, this third one. The fourth stage would be the prototype build and test. It will focus on verifying the performance and the acceptability for production of the chosen platforms. And late in this fourth phase, a down select competition will be conducted for a single low rate initial production contractor. The last stage will be the production and fielding, and a single contract will be awarded. And actually, the Army intends to select the winner by 2027.
Thanks, Valia. Yeah, for our listeners, obviously you are no doubt interested in learning more about this program, so please stay tuned for a little bit later on in the show. Finally, Tim, moving to the Air Desk, bring us up to date what's been happening over the past couple of weeks.
Yeah, Rich, I'll just do a quick recap, I guess, of what might have been missed over Christmas and the new year. So one of the big deals that went through via FMS was Kuwait buying Apache helicopters. So it becomes the fourth country in the Middle East to be buying the Boeing attack helicopters, and that's a deal worth $4 billion. So an interesting one there, because they're also re-equipping on the rotary side with the heavy lift H225M from Airbus. So yeah, I mean, that's, I suppose, quite a significant movement on their part in terms of rotary wing developments. And then we also had just this week, actually, confirmation that the UAE are going to be adding to their fleet of Global Eyes. So that they'll take the fleet up to 5 in total, and a contract has been signed for 2 additional aircraft. On that one, I suppose it's quite interesting because it was announced in November of 2019 at the Dubai Air Show that this order for the additional 2 Global Eyes from the UAE was in the final negotiation stage. So it's taken 14 months from that final negotiation period to get the contract over the line. Because our news team kind of were the ones that put that together, we don't have any additional comments from SAB, and very unlikely that you ever get anything official from the UAE. And so I would just wonder why that has taken so long, but I suppose it's almost a bit of an irrelevance given that the deal is finally over the line.
Yeah, it's a really interesting couple of sales and a potential sale. If you take it into context of the lifting of the Saudi UAE embargo on Qatar, which we were talking about offline, of course. Now, I was speaking to a former CIA signals intelligence operator last month, and he was sort of commenting that the GCC, given the UAE's and Bahrain's new ties with Israel, Saudi's thawing of relations with Israel, are looking to form coalitions against possible future threats from Iran, he said. So do you think that these procurements could be seen in that context, that this is a sort of increasing commonality between potential allies is a good first step? And also, second point is that this points to, as I said, increasing commonality among GCC countries, which have been trying for decades to unify a military command, which had somewhat of a breakthrough in 2020. So on the operational side, the equipment, there's commonality. And on the headquarters and the command side, there's a breakthrough there. So do you think that there's a solidifying of military ties and operational practice between GCC and Middle East against perceived threats, possibly from Iran?
Yeah, I mean, I think, the turning over of a new leaf, so to speak, and the end of the Qatar blockade is absolutely symbolic, first and foremost. And, it does, as you mentioned, kind of suggest that there's more friendly relations being developed. But I still think it's a long way to imagine. Well, maybe not a long way, but it's difficult to imagine in the weeks ahead, maybe, or months ahead, that you could see Qatari aircraft and Israeli aircraft, for example, flying together on joint missions and something like that. I think there is still tension in the Gulf, and it's fantastic to see that they're on a political front, that things are moving forward. But I militarily, I'm not just quite sure if this all means that things will move forward just so quickly or easily. But on the other hand, it's quite obvious that from the Americans' point of view, that signing off contracts with those in the Middle East who are allies of theirs and to contain Iran is absolutely number one priority. That's going to continue, and you're seeing these, particularly in the last days of the Trump administration, that so many FMS deals to the Middle East are going through. There's absolutely no coincidence about really why that's happening. Get these over the line before there's a dim review perhaps taken by the Biden administration. And as we heard on the podcast before from other sources, that the whole idea of opening up these types of deals and it affecting the Israeli military balance within the region is a little bit of a red herring, basically because Israel have such a superior air force and have such experience when it comes to military operations and things like that. So, I think it's important to highlight that one. But to the point of whether this all sets a stage for joint operations between GCC and things like that, we'll hold off maybe on that one for a little bit. And I'm not, I could be wrong, of course, but I don't think it's quite as easy to imagine that, just because the nature of the political agreements have been signed and the end of the blockade, as I say, perhaps symbolic for now, more so than anything happening in a meaningful way.
Good points. Well made. Thanks, Tim. Thanks all. As always, if you'd like to find out more about Shephard's daily defence coverage, you can visit our website, shepherdmedia.com/news. And coming up next, I speak with Matthew Smith, Director of Analysis at Shephard Defence Insight, about how military markets and procurements of 2021 might fare, so stay tuned.
Their goal is to win without going to war, to achieve their objectives by breaking our willpower, using attacks below the threshold that would prompt a warfighting response. These attacks on our way of life from authoritarian rivals and extremist ideologies are remarkably difficult to defeat without undermining the very freedoms we want to protect. We are exposed through our openness.
This is General Sir Nick Carter, head of the UK Armed Forces. Speaking at the Policy Exchange think tank, General Carter sounded a grave warning. The UK and its allies are operating in a rapidly changing world. And while a focus on counterinsurgency operations may have dominated the early years of the century, attention has now shifted to the threat posed by China and Russia.
Their way of warfare is strategic. It is synchronised and it is systematic, and our response must be too.
This is Shephard Studios' podcast series on Five Eyes connectivity, sponsored by our partner, Viasat. In this second series, we're exploring the military connectivity issues facing the Five Eyes nations and looking at the work underway to ensure communication networks can withstand the expected threats of tomorrow. In this episode, we focus on the UK and hear how a rapidly shifting threat environment is driving a transformation of British military capabilities. As General Carter puts it, the British military is moving from an industrial age of platforms to an information age of systems. The Five Eyes Connectivity podcast was created by Shephard Studio in partnership with our sponsor, Viasat. To learn more about Viasat's support to the Five Eyes nations, visit fiveeyesconnect.com for capability profiles, white papers, videos, and more. Until next time.
After the 12 months that have just gone by, one might be a little wary about making predictions on what the coming year might bring, not least in the defence sector, in a landscape that is effectively being redrawn before our very eyes. From the differing measures taken by the world's forces to sustain operations, some slightly less ethical than others, I'm looking at you, China, to the crashing of Western economies already falling behind the progress of Eastern rivals, or the expected but not yet materialised crunch to defence budgets, it's fair to say markets have bobbed on some stormy seas in 2020. Nevertheless, Shephard is going to give it a shot, and that means welcoming the first of the New Year's Defence Insight segments to the podcast, and I'm pleased to introduce its foremost prognosticator, Director of Analysis, Matt Smith. Hi, Matt. Welcome back to the show.
That is very kind, Richard. Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be back on again. It's been a while.
It has indeed. Great to start 2021 so brightly. It was a battle for the budgets in 2020, wasn't it? With the US, arguing long into the night about how much and where it might spend its FY request. Add to that, I should say, that the new president or the incoming president doesn't really follow much of what his predecessor did in terms of redeployment, geopolitical issues, or concentration perhaps on the renewal of the nuclear triad. How do you see that dynamic changing the US defence market through 2021? And where might the biggest impact be felt?
Yeah. So, as you said, Richard, the US is in the middle of some quite significant change, and we're seeing the Congress may well be swapping hands as well as the presidency, which obviously has quite a significant impact on, President Biden's priorities going forward. But in 2021, I think the most likely trend we're going to see is, to a certain extent, more of the same. I think it's going to take, at least a year for President Biden to enact any significant changes or put into place anything that he really wants to do with the budget. So I think for 21, we're going to see a continued focus on some of the key areas, and primarily in the US Army, that's around mobility and artillery. When we were thinking about the key programs we were looking at for this year, where we want to identify and what we want to focus on, the one that really stands out in the US is the high mobility Striker Brigade combat teams and the replacement of the wheeled artillery there. That sort of replacement with the next generation wheeled howitzer is probably one of the most significant programs within the Army at the moment. It's one where there's been this very clear focus on a rapid acquisition. And even although the DoD is yet to sort of really talk about how many systems they want to acquire, and even really what the full potential budget is, we can make some sort of reasonably educated guesses about what the scope of that program might be. At the minute, if we were looking at, say, a full replacement of all the field artillery battalions on a like-for-like basis, that's looking around 160 odd vehicles. When we've covered other self-propelled howitzer programs and previously, those systems come out at around $4.5 to $5 million each. So this program is potentially worth around $750 million. So a very, very significant program. Now, this focus on rapid acquisition means that we're actually expecting the shoot-off to happen in Q2 this year. And so a decision, hopefully, fairly soon after that. The other kind of program we're looking at is the OMFV. Now, it was restarted last year. Down select contracts are expected in June, but that's one really where it's still relatively immature in terms of where it is in the the procurement process. So again, is this one where if there was going to be changes, perhaps it's one where you might see change because it's much easier to stop given where it is in the procurement cycle. An actual contract isn't expected until 2027, so there's still plenty of time for that to change.
Plenty of time, as you say, 6 years and counting. So the UK, then, it's obviously the erstwhile ally of the US, also, faces a range of challenges in 2021 as well, dealing with the early months of Brexit. Who knows how that will actually happen? Completing the integrated review. Who knows how that will actually happen? Deploying the Queen Elizabeth Carrier Strike Group. We think we know how that might happen. We'll try anyway. And also trying to deal with the fiscal black hole that the MOD has to try and contend with. How might its key programs, UK's key programs, fare in 2021? Particularly, I think there seems to be weaknesses, one suspects and many suspect, on the land side.
I think you're absolutely right there, Richard. It's honestly very, very difficult to pick up on a specific program because there's just so much uncertainty. On the one hand, there's this. There was the slightly surprising news of a £16.5 billion settlement back in November. But even with that new money, it's very unclear where it's going to be spent. And I think that's partly because we're still in a situation where the integrated review hasn't yet been completed. There's still a lot of uncertainty about what our global role is going to be post-Brexit and what maybe even it should be. And there's a definite sense that the Army in particular was left a little bit in limbo. Very little was heard about the Challenger 2 LEP programme. It's unclear what's going on with Warrior. One thing I did think that was very interesting, however, which came out just towards the end of the Christmas time, was announced. It was a report in The Guardian, actually, that the MOD was interested in investigating UCAV projects, so drawing on the experiences of Azerbaijan in the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict, and its use of these lower-cost UCAV type drones, the Bayraktar. And it didn't seem to get much traction at the time, and yet I find that a very interesting position for the MOD to take, because it's really a statement of intent in some ways that says, look into the future, we may well have to look at these kind of cost capability trade-offs. We're not going to be able to buy dozens and dozens of Guardian-type Reapers. The actual things that we're going to be looking at are these much more cost-effective type solutions. And I wonder if what we're seeing there is the start of a much more in-depth conversation about where we're going to find those trade-offs and how we're going to do it.
It's an interesting story to refer to. I mean, obviously the UK's dabbled with smaller UAVs. You've got the Watchkeeper, but that's currently going through untold amounts of trouble in operation, almost trials in operation with the British Army. So I guess it's a question of which service do you really want to operate UCAVs. That's I'll leave that one for the MOD. Just going back to the land programs, one example that I think has been actually quite positive, frankly, has been the Land 400 competition in Australia. You've got the Redback and the Lynx competing there. Now, the Australians have really got a great focus as to what they want to do with their armed forces, all the branches. So how do you think, let's say, the Land 400 program might fare this year?
I think Land 400 is very, very interesting because it speaks to the fact that actually a lot of the activity that's going on in particularly the tracked segment is happening outside of the US. Land 400 is the Redback and the Lynx are having their trials this year. If they go forward with that, it looks like a decision again going to be made. That program appears to be very well on track. So the key element with the Australian programs, I think, is that the procurement process has been very, very structured. They've looked at using much more established technologies, so they're not really looking for anything particularly out there or innovative or revolutionary. It's very much a de-risking the process using established programs, and also very significantly, of course, is the level of industrial participation that they're requiring in that project as well. And if we were thinking about elements that we might see more of in 2021. Given all of the economic constraints that we're expecting to see on military procurement across the world, in the aftermath of COVID-19, I think those two elements will start to play a really big part of it. Military is looking to de-risk their programs and also looking for even more levels of industrial participation, or at least being able to share in the economic benefits of those programs.
Moving to the air side, and obviously much of the focus over the past year has been on the acquisition of existing programs, or platforms, I should say, like the F-35, Typhoon, Gripen, etc. And of course, the nascent sixth-generation programs have begun to move forward, albeit quite slowly. Germany, I think, was an interesting case for Europe in 2020, I thought, because it had a split fighter decision. They split by in its fighter decision. And it also decided to ditch a much-needed renewal to the heavy rotary lift capability. It's quite clear that Germany needs newer heavy lift platforms. So do you think it might get a restart, a rebrand in the coming 12 months?
Our view is that the need for that heavy lift capability is so great, they will have to do something about it. Again, without wanting to bring everything back to Brexit, but in a post-Brexit Europe, both France and Germany will need to take on a greater share of the burden in terms of the wider European defence picture, which, to be fair, Germany has been stepping up to in recent years. What that picture looks like, I think, is at the minute very uncertain. We've seen in Europe recently a trend towards more multilateral type procurement. So it may be that the German MOD is thinking that potentially might be a way of addressing that capability gap. So relying more on perhaps OCCAR or some of the other institutions to fund something that actually meets more than just a national capability. It may be that it was just a political decision, and then now the political environment is a bit clearer in Germany, then things can progress. But whatever happens, they will need something. And they will need something at a pretty significant scale. We expect that to progress quite significantly in 2021.
Yeah, I think you're quite right to bring in the idea of multinational collaborations across Europe with the work that PESCO does, and the EDA, of course, investing in the PESCO programs. Just finally then, if we're talking about 2021 and, say, future thinking, how can we possibly have a conversation on the podcast about future defense thinking without talking about automation and technology and machine learning and AI? It's supposed to be this force enabler, isn't it? Do you think it's realistic? I would contend it is not realistic that these kind of technologies can be fielded in the timeframes that are being talked about by the services and the ministries of defences. Certainly not in the timeframe that the operators need them on the ground, at sea and in the air. I mean, what are your thoughts on this? I guess a long-winded question. Is it a case of sinking resources today for a capability that might not even be ready by tomorrow?
I think it's a really interesting question, and I think that AI and automation is just on a scale. And I think there's a whole range of different things that you can do with those kinds of technologies that sit somewhere further down the scale than, huge decision support engines or automated AI cyberspace type activities. And I think, we're looking at as being much more, practical are things like automations within systems themselves. So smaller scale things that allow systems to operate with fewer users. So rather than it being a replacement for the man, it's more thing or woman. It should be things. It's likely to be technologies that allow you to do more with less or more with the same. So decision support, for example, we might see things like robotics, but not fully automated robotics, but more elements where you just replace, for example, in an artillery system, rather than having a manually loaded turret, you automate that whole process, and you automate the whole process from stopping, shooting, aiming, rather than having a person in the loop doing it. And I think those kinds of technologies are the ones that are of most interest at the minute, certainly to a lot of the kind of more practically minded people within MODs, because they're the ones that they see, if you integrate them now into your systems, they will allow for significant cost savings later on. And I think, we're seeing that quite a lot in shipbuilding. The fewer people you can have on your crew because you've introduced more automations, the more efficient it makes those ships, and so the running costs become lower. So that, and I agree with you. I think that to me is the sweet spot at the minute for that kind of automation discussion, rather than I guess what we thought might be the case a few years ago, having fully autonomous combat aircraft flying around the place, and that I think is that kind of approach to me really has dropped off the agenda.
I think that's right. I think we need to walk a little bit faster before we can learn how to jog and then run eventually.
Absolutely.
On that, we'll have to leave it there. I've been Richard Thomas. My thanks to Matt Smith. Matt, we're looking forward to welcoming the rest of your analytics team on in the coming months. Thanks again.
But thank you very much, Richard.
It's not that we can't hit the targets we want to hit, it's that we can't hit enough of them with the missiles and the launch platforms that we can get close enough, or that we can afford.
Another worry I have is it's the kind of Kodak moment with missiles. Is at what point does the paradigm shift kick in? At what point have you reached the end of the road with missiles? And at what point do you need to start investing in other technologies?
The global threat landscape is changing, but the UK isn't standing still. In November, the government pledged an extra £16.5 billion for military investment over the next 4 years. This money is aimed at modernising the armed forces, helping them to adapt to a new strategic reality. A range of new or rapidly developing complex weapon technologies have come into focus in recent years for the UK and its NATO allies. But what exactly is driving these shifting equipment priorities?
To develop a credible either ballistic missile or hypersonic missile defence system there would cost in the billions of pounds, which we just don't have in the UK, that it's got to be as a collaborative effort.
Welcome to the Defining the Future podcast, Shephard Studios' series on aerospace and defence innovation, sponsored by our partner Raytheon UK. Over the course of 4 episodes, we will tell the story of how innovation, fostered by industry, is helping the UK step out of the shadow of Brexit and the COVID-19 pandemic. We will hear how emerging technologies are supporting the prosperity agenda developed by the government to accelerate Britain's growth in these uncertain times. And we will hear from representatives across industry about how transformation and cutting-edge technologies designed for the military are beginning to reshape the commercial sector. To learn more about efforts underway to deliver the complex weapons of the future, listen to the Defining the Future podcast, available now wherever you get your podcasts.
The US Army is progressing with the OMFV program. In December 2020, this service released the final request for proposals for the concept design phase. This process is the newest attempt to move ahead with the replacement of the Bradley IFV. The other acquisition programs didn't progress like the US Army expected and were terminated, which keep the Bradley in service despite it's more than 30 years old. What will be the Army's main challenges in this current process? Join me today to answer this and other questions about the OMFV program is Mark Kensian. He's a former colonel in the United States Marine Corps and senior advisor at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Mark, welcome to the Weekly Defense Podcast.
Thanks for having me on the show.
So, what's the goal of this final request for proposal for the concept design phase issued in December?
Well, the Army wants to move forward with a Bradley replacement. They've been trying to do that for really 2 decades. And this is the next step of their most recent attempt to do that.
And why has it been so difficult to replace the Bradley, in your point of view?
There are 2 major challenges to replacing the Bradley. One is regarding to requirements for the program, and the other one is about strategy. The requirements problem is that if you want to build an armored vehicle that can withstand threats on a modern battlefield that is survivable, you end up with something that's very heavy. And in fact, the previous attempt to build design a Bradley replacement ended up being in the 50, 60, 70-ton range, like a Abrams tank, because you had to put a lot of armor on it to be survivable. And at that size, it was just very large, very expensive. It was not the lighter infantry fighting vehicle that people had envisioned. There's also a problem about making it optionally manned. And it's not just a problem with the Bradley replacement. It's a problem across the board when DoD tries to make systems that are optionally manned, because when you do that, you have to put in all of the systems to have human beings in the platform, but then you also have to add all the things to make it remotely operable. So you really end up with this redundancy. If you're just going to make it unmanned, then you can take out all the human systems, you can redesign, make it much smaller, because you don't need to have human beings in there. And that tension, I think, has also hurt the program. There's also a strategic problem, which is a Bradley replacement is to improve, upgrade the Army's abilities to fight a ground combat. But when you look around, the only place that really becomes important to have an upgraded system there is in a conflict with Russia. And there are a couple of problems there. I mean, one is, of course, the major focus is on China. And Russia, although it is a great power and is a challenge to the United States, is not rated as high as the challenges from China. The other problem is it's just hard to get at Russia. The problem with the conflict with Russia is first making sure that they can't do a fait accompli. That is, that they can't take over the Baltic states before NATO can respond. And the second problem is, how do you launch a counteroffensive? You have to do it out of Poland. The fronts are very narrow. You have to come across the Baltic. The problem isn't, massed armored warfare on the plains of Europe the way it was back during the Cold War. So because of the U.S. focus on China and because of the difficulty in just getting at Russia in a conflict, the strategic need for the system isn't as great as it was, for example, back during the Cold War.
Yeah, as you said, the Army is trying to replace the Bradley for 2 decades. Can you speak briefly about the previous attempt?
Well, the Army's made several previous attempts, and they've all run into this same problem. That is, getting something that is enough of a improvement, enough of an upgrade that's worth the cost, and to do it in a way that is, not replicating like the Abrams. So the several previous attempts, basically, petered out. And I would say also that there has been in the past, and there will be in the future, a budget challenge. One of the reasons that the previous attempts did not get traction was that they were coming forward during the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. And of course, when the United States was focusing on counterinsurgency, an upgraded Bradley was not very high on the list. There might have been some value in, of course, making it more resistant to mines and IEDs. But in terms of the list of things you wanted to do, it was pretty far down. Now that we're looking at great power conflicts, it's moved up a little. But we're facing budget challenges, both the top line to DOD. Everyone expects that there will be at least some cuts under a Biden administration. And the Army itself, they have what they call 31+3 modernization programs, and, of which the Bradley replacement is one. So it's competing with a lot of other programs. And even the Army acknowledges they can't do all of it. They're going to have to make some decisions. And that's going to be a challenge for a Bradley replacement also.
Do you think the Army is more flexible in this current process?
Well, I know they're trying to be more flexible. And, to their credit, they gave up on some previous attempts and started over. There were also some, new contracting devices that they can use. So I will give them credit there. But, they're going to face some really tough decisions, likely in the spring and summer, as they decide which ones of these 31+3 programs they want to bring forward.
And in this current process, the Army invited the industry to take part, to provide feedback. How can it improve the OMFV procurement process?
Well, going out to industry, I think, is a very sound approach. You've seen that in some of the other services. Also, seeing what industry can provide and trying to leverage what's already out there rather than building something from scratch. When the Army has tried that in the past for its ground combat vehicles, those have been not very successful. Think of the Future Combat System, 15, 18 different systems designed from the bottom up, all designed to work together. I mean, in concept, it was great. It failed utterly. And the Army got badly burned on that. Along with a couple of other programs, too. There was a Comanche helicopter, again, designed from the bottom up, very expensive. That also collapsed. So going out to industry and seeing what's available and leveraging that to the extent possible makes a lot of sense.
And do you think there is any platform and vehicle available in the market that could meet the Army needs for the OMFV?
I'm going to say that I'm not sure. I would recommend that the Army take a close look at what's out there. The United States has leveraged what's in allied markets in the past. The Stryker, for example, which the Army has bought a large number of was, I think, originally a Canadian design. The Navy, for example, in developing its light amphibious warship, went out to industry and looks to be picking something from industry. For their frigate program, they did the same thing. They went out to industry and they picked the Italian design. So I think that there is a precedent for doing that. On the other hand, there's a tremendous reluctance to ease up on some requirements. That's going to be a stumbling block. I think back to when the Army was building the Crusader howitzer. Germany had a Panzer Howitzer 2000, I think it was called, which, sort of did 90% of what the Army wanted. And it would have been, I think, a very wise thing to have moved to that. But because it didn't do 100%, they didn't use the German design. And then the Crusader program falls apart. So the Army ended up with nothing. Now they did upgrade the existing 109 series to the Paladin and the Paladin improvement. So I think they're on the A7 or something. But they might have made a real jump forward if they had gone with the German system.
Yeah, in this current process, the Army has a 5-step plan to replace the Bradley. Can we provide more details about the next phases? What will be their goals?
I'm going to have to say I'm not really sure about those details. I can say that there's going to be a longer process as the Army sees what's out there, sees what might be achievable, and then has that compete with all the other 31+3 systems that are out there. So unlike in some programs where there's a competition and then there's an immediately movement into a formal program, I think it's going to continue to be an extended process.
And you said maybe the budget would be the main challenge in this process. Do you think the Army will face other challenges as well?
Well, I think the budget and the strategy are going to be two huge challenges. The strategy will probably change a little, but it'll remain focused on China and Russia to, I think, a lesser extent, probably pulling forces out of the Middle East, but still staying engaged and emphasizing engagement with allies and partners. But because of that focus on the Indo-Pacific, that leans towards the Navy and the Air Force. The Pacific is mainly a maritime theater. And although the Army has some important contributions to make in a conflict with China, the Navy and the Air Force would have a dominant role. So many people, when they look at the way forward, look at the Army as a bill payer. In other words, making the Army much smaller. Right now, the regular Army is about 284,000, I think, or rather 484,000. People talk about taking that down to 450,000, 420,000. And when you start making those kinds of trade-offs, all of the acquisition programs are going to be badly squeezed.
Do you think it's possible for the Army to overcome these challenges in the next few years and to move forward with the OMFV program?
It's going to be hard because unless something happens that would put more emphasis on ground forces, something in Europe, for example, I think it's going to be very hard for the Army to maintain the force structure that it wants to maintain on the active side and on the reserve side, and also to do the acquisitions that it wants to do. And the problem they also have is that you noted that the original Bradley design, dates from the 1980s, even really from the 1970s, but it's been upgraded a lot. So the Bradley that you have running around now is very different from the Bradley you had in the 1980s. And although it does not meet all the requirements that the Army has, it's certainly a much better, more effective vehicle than what the Army had in the past. And so, I think a lot of people are going to look at this and say, well, maybe we can just make do for a while longer, sort of keep a research program going, a development program going on a replacement, because eventually, the Army will need to do that. But it may sort of stay in this developmental exploration phase for a bit longer. And I think we'll know the answer to that in the next 6 months. The Biden administration, of course, will take office on January 20th. They'll start looking at changes to the current budget, the FY21 budget. They'll be developing a 2022 budget that'll probably come out in about May. And both of those will give a little sense about where this program and many other programs are going. And then they'll come out with a strategy probably a year from now, maybe next December. And then that, again, will give more indication about where the program is going. So I think that there will be indications coming out periodically about where the Army is going, where its acquisition programs are going, and therefore where OMFDS is, where the Bradley replacement is going.
So thank you very much, Mark, for joining us today.
Okay. Well, thank you for having me on the show.
You've been listening to another episode of the Weekly Defence Podcast. As always, a big thanks to everyone who took the time in being with us today. And for our listeners, if you enjoyed the show, make sure you like and subscribe, leave a review on iTunes, Spotify, Google Play, or wherever you get your podcast. Until next week, thanks for listening.